Welcome to Gamilearn. Today I will talk about the 5 gamification languages, the secret to gameful experiences that last. As Johan said, my name is Lennart Nacke. I work at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and over there I actually lead a team of very nice students, and we all work in the space of gamification, gameful design, as well as games user research. And all of that knowledge, of course, transcends into the research that we present internationally, and all of that informs the ideas that I'm presenting today to you. So, what am I talking about today? Today, the main idea that I want to share with you is that in gamification, or in gameful design, in any kind of design, we can find something like a language. So we can view certain methods of interaction as languages. Where do I get that idea from? Well, so I recently read a book called The 5 Love Languages from an author, Gary Chapman, and he wrote that book trying to help us understand how relationships work. Now, being a game designer, I read that book with a system-centric view, thinking that relationships, I know relationships in object-oriented design, in programming. Relationships tell us one object likes another object, and there is some sort of interaction between those two objects. And having that view helped me understand the way that the book phrases our human relationships in a way that we could also look at relationships of objects in a game world. So that's where the idea came from. So thinking about that, I then looked at languages as what do languages do for us? What do languages help us do in our real life? Languages help us solve problems. They help us communicate. They help us structure the way that we interact with one another. And of course, I got to experience that recently as I came to Spain, and I visited the colleagues in Barcelona, and now I'm here in Tenerife, and languages are so much more than just words. They are signs, they are symbols, they help us express beliefs and cultures. And so when I came here, it was very clear to me in the last days in Spain, I wasn't able to speak the language, right? Like other than hola and maybe buenos dias, and that's it, right? Like I wasn't actually able to interact a lot. So for me, it was more looking at the gestures of the hands, looking at the facial expressions of people around me when they were engaging in a Spanish conversation. It was trying to pick up cultural clues from what restaurant we were at and what the environment is, and trying to understand the way just based on the signs and symbols that are around me, instead of comprehending the words that are actually there. So it was just this idea, okay, how can I make sense of this world that I don't fully comprehend because I'm just not able to speak the words? So interpreting the signs and symbols and helping me transform everything around me just based on that context, okay? So if we see languages that way, then languages, yes, they allow us to communicate with one another, but they also allow us to understand our actions and the context in which these actions are done. So languages are, again, they're more than just the words that we say. Languages are a form of expression. How do we express something that we need, something that we want? How do we express that to one another? How do we make clear that we want to interact with another person in a way? And you might have experienced that if you've ever traveled to a country where you don't speak the language, that all of a sudden you're using not just your mouth and your words, but maybe you're drawing something, maybe you're using big hand gestures, or you're adding other symbols to your expression. So languages are allowing us to exchange knowledge. They're allowing us to exchange beliefs, opinions, wishes, even threats, commands, thank yous, promises, feelings in general, and only our imagination really limits where languages can take us. So really, coming back to the context of Gamilearn, languages are important tools for learning. if we do not speak the language, if we do not comprehend the language within which we are, we cannot learn correctly. So, for gamification, what does that mean? Well, maybe first of all, I don't think I have to actually explain to this audience what gamification is, but just as a reminder, we did write a paper in 2011 where we defined it as using game design in non-gaming contexts. And so the idea being we're using games in things that are really not games. And so I think this image is quite nice to help us understand that games are used in a system or a software where usually we would use other processes to showcase that system. So games themselves are also formal closed systems. Whenever we talk about game design, we really talk about system design, understanding what a system is. And games as systems themselves essentially represent a subset of our reality. Right now, we're not playing a game. We're in real life. We're sitting here. The communication is really one way because I'm speaking to you. I read your faces, so that's sort of the communication that I get back from you. But it's really non-verbal from your side, and it's verbal from my side. So that's the communication that we're in. But it is a formal system. It's a closed system. There's a door. We're in a room. And games, in a similar way, have that idea of a formal closed system. You accept the game rules. You accept what we call the magic circle of the game. And then you say, okay, I want to follow those rules. I want to be in that game space. So games are these spaces within which we can let those rules apply to us. And also games can be seen as sets of elements where these elements then interact with one another. And this is, again, what we see here, we see those little toys. Really, a game comes from the interaction of those elements. It doesn't just come from spilling the toys on the floor, but it's like, so what's that fork going to do with that truck? And then what's that truck going to do with that sign, right? Like when children engage in play, they make up all these rules. They say, okay, now the fork stabs you, the truck goes here, brum, brum, brum. And so they make up this game system within which then you can operate. And for the longest time, we didn't understand how to do these things correctly, and we're actually still struggling sometimes. At some point, game designer Greg Kostikian made a point out of our misunderstanding of the actual game world. And he wrote this essay called "I Have No Words and I Must Design" towards a critical vocabulary for games. And to quote him, he said, "It is important to understand how and why game structures do shape player behavior." So really, he said, we as designers, we lack the vocabulary that we need to build effective games, effective game designs. We don't actually understand our actions as designers in a way that helps us build good gaming experiences. And it doesn't help us understand how we want a player to behave. Now in gamification, again, we're using the games outside of that game space where it's all fun, but we're trying to get people to learn, we're trying to get behavior change to happen. So really we have to think about, how do we shape player behavior? How do we do that? Greg Kostikian back then didn't know it. Do we actually know that today? Do we know how to shape this kind of, how we mold this kind of player behavior? It's at the heart of what is good gamification. So, to try and get there, I will now take you on a journey of first understanding how we can frame a game, and then understanding how we can frame gameful experiences, and then getting to the 5 languages that help us understand these systems. So, first of all, how do we understand what makes a game a game? And so, for those of you that are not native speakers, this looks like a lot of intimidating, big, big fancy words for things that are happening inside of a game. And it's basically based a lot on the research of Bernard Suits in the book The Grasshopper, who was one of the theorists trying to define the games and the game spaces. And so he came up with these 4 concepts: pre-nursery goals, illusory means, constitutive rules, and illusory attitude. What does that mean? Well, first of all, if we know a little bit of Latin, we know that ludus usually refers to game. So having that illusory word in there is usually something that refers to what a game is. So pre-illusory goals means goals that we bring to the table to then play the game. It's what we have before the game starts, pre-illusory, the goals that we have before the game actually engages us. Every time we play a game, we're attempting to reach a specific state. If you use system theory, that's the idea that we have. We are an object entering the game world. We want to reach a specific state at some point. We want some outcome out of the game. So the pre-illusory goals are those goals that we bring into the game world. And everyone has them, right? Like maybe you play the game to win. That's a goal that you bring to the game. Maybe you play the game to get money out of it. Maybe you play the game to tease your opponent. Maybe you play the game just to annoy the other person that you're playing with. It doesn't actually matter whether you win. You just want to make that person upset. Maybe you play the game to build a friendship. Maybe you play the game to have some sort of social connection. These are the goals that you bring into the game. Everyone has them before we start playing the game. Now then, the illusory means are essentially the framework within which we operate in the game world. Now we're entering the game, and then the illusory means are, you could say, the core set that fits us at that point. It's the rules that we put in that we put into play, and it's anything, any action that's allowed by the rules. Okay? Otherwise, I would have just called it rules. But illusory means are rules and anything attached to those rules in the game world. Okay, so that's what makes the game tick. Now, what are then the constitutive rules? The constitutive rules are the things that we put in place in the game world that prevent us from using something more efficient. Yeah. So if you think about a board game and you roll a dice to move forward, you could just move the little pin of the game all the way to the end. What prevents you from doing that? Well, the constitutive rules. The constitutive rules say, no, you can only move it as many spaces as the die roll says. That's the rule. You decide to follow that rule. You could also say, well, instead of one die roll, I'm going to roll 5 or 6 die because that's going to make my character go faster. That's not the constitutive rule. At that point, you would be cheating because you're not adhering to the constitutive rules of the game, right? So the constitutive rules are what the game designer has put into place to make you less efficient, to put a challenge in your way. So you're enjoying that constraint of your action, saying, oh, I can't actually do that. It's a little bit more difficult. Well, let's see if I can do it anyways, because I want to overcome that difficulty. And then finally, the illusory attitude. And this is a very important concept in Sood's definition of games. It's the willingness to accept and abide by the rules of the game. What does that mean? It means when you're entering the game world, you're saying all of the game rules apply to me. So whenever I lose, it's not a negotiation. I accept that I've lost at that point. And again, if we look at the concept of languages, when we have a conflict, we can just negotiate, we can have a discussion, and then, okay, maybe at some point somebody, that person says, okay, I've won the argument, okay, I have the better idea. But then maybe you go home and then you tell your spouse, no, I won the argument, that other person didn't win the argument. There's no deciding factor that says, okay, this person or that person has won the argument. You make it up, it's based on your perception. Whereas in a game, it's a very clear rule that says, well, this is who wins and this is who loses. You accept that when you enter the game world. You accept those rules as something that is in place. And so that acceptance of the game is the illusory attitude. And that's really important when you're going into the space of serious games or gamification, where sometimes companies will say, here, we've built this amazing learning game. Everyone in the company now has to play it. Well, it's not going to be effective. There's actually a lot of research that shows it's not effective if the person doesn't want to play it. If you're saying, well, this is a great learning game, well, that's nice. If they don't want to play it, they will not learn anything. They will not get any of the knowledge that the game provides, right? They need to opt in. So you need to make it an option. You can play the game. You don't have to play the game. And then it will work. Okay, so going more into this understanding of what a game is then, I want to cite Clark C. Abt, another theoretical game researcher that has looked at trying to understand what games are. And again, there's a lot of different definitions of games, but I find this one quite poignant for the ideas that I have. A game, according to Clark C. Abt, is a context with rules among adversaries trying to win objectives. This is important because it now says we're in a context, we're in this context where we decide we have rules, the rules govern how the things work in that context, and we have adversaries. So there's people that have one objective, but there's also people that have a different objective, and they're usually confronting each other. And everyone has a goal, they're trying to get to an objective, so they're getting somewhere from wherever they were at the start. That is essentially what makes up a game system. Okay, so let's try and use some of that knowledge to analyze a popular game, Pokemon Go, which I know some people really like. And so if we tried to bring that game into this system framework, we essentially have the following. We've got objects, we have attributes, we have internal relationships between those objects in the system, and we have an environment, the context in which it operates. So let's try and see if we can find... Does everyone here know Pokemon Go? Is anyone here that knows Pokemon Go at all? Has anyone played it? Okay, it's like half the audience maybe. Okay, so those of you that have played it, think about it. In Pokemon Go, what are the objects that we have in Pokemon Go? Any ideas? Anyone that sort of familiar? What could be the objects in Pokemon Go? A Pokeball, yeah, a Pokeball. The Pokemon themselves, yeah. Other ideas?
The boost or the power-ups or the items, I guess?
Yeah, exactly. Boosters, power-ups, items. The Pokestops, the gyms where you can battle. Yeah, so we can see there's lots of items, objects that we have in the game world that now have to interact with one another, because just having a Pokemon doesn't make a Pokemon game. Just having a Pokeball doesn't make a Pokemon game. Having a Pokestop does not make a game. These are all singular objects. Okay, so let's think about attributes. Let's think about the attribute of a Pokeball. What is the attribute of a Pokeball? Any idea? What do I mean by attribute? What can that thing do? How does it look like? How does it feel?
Pokeball type.
Hmm?
Pokeball type.
Pokeball type, you get the normal ball, the advanced ball. It's round? What else can we do with a Pokeball? Throw it, yes, exactly. We can throw the ball. So all of these are attributes, things that I can do with that object. Now let's think about a Pokemon. What can I do to a Pokemon inside Pokemon Go? Catch it, first thing. What else? Train it, feed it some candy, evolve it, let it fight. Exactly. All of these things are attributes. It can fight, it can do other things. All of these are attributes that these objects can do. Now let's look at the relationships. Let's look at the relationship between a Pokeball and a Pokemon. What relationship do they have to one another? Pokeball, Pokemon. What do they do? Exactly. So the Pokeball has a relationship to the Pokemon, saying, okay, when the Pokeball hits the Pokemon, it catches the Pokemon. Okay? The Pokemon itself has a relationship to the ball. Whenever the ball hits me, I have a random decision whether I want to be caught or not, because sometimes the Pokemon escapes, right? So these are the internal relationships that we then now have between the objects in the game world. Now the next thing is the environment. What's the environment that this game system operates in? How do we play Pokemon Go? In the real world. It's a layer over the real world. Now we have to catch Pokemon at different locations that we have to physically walk to. So the environment of the game is intertwined with our real environment, partially making for the fun in this game, that now we have that extra layer that we have to deal with. So that's very interesting, because it gives us now an idea of, if we have a game, this is how every game is set up. Every game is set up by having these distinct entities, the objects, then the object's having a distinct or having several distinct attributes that say, this is an option that I have as an object, and this is the relationship that I have to other objects. All of a sudden, we have some form of interaction in the game system, and then to make that interaction more interesting, we add it into an environment. And there you have it. This is the secret of any game. Any game can be broken down into these objects. So this is important when we go into understanding how to do the game design part. But then, of course, since we're talking about gamification, we also have to revisit one of the important theories of motivation. Now, every time we think about how to make something motivating as gamification designers, often we draw on self-determination theory. This is a theory developed by researchers Ryan and Deci that try to distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. These are different factors that motivate us to do something. Okay, so far so good. What does that have to do with games? Well, in the early days of gamification, we had a lot of people thinking that the game layer, as it was called, or the gamification that you can do, is something such as an extrinsic reward. You can give a point to someone, you can give a badge to someone, you can put them on a leaderboard. That's a game, right? It's actually not a game. It's just this tiny, tiny part of what could be a game. It's the extrinsic motivation part, as Ryan and Deci call it. However, they outline that it's much more important to captivate human behavior and to motivate humans to do intrinsic motivation. This is the motivation that drives us to become better as person, that drives our own behavior to become stronger over time, to really stick to a learning goal. And these three dimensions make up self-determination theory. We have competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Now, what is competence? Competence is a feeling that the game gives us that we are in control. We're feeling like whatever skills we have are being matched by the environment that we're in. That environment now helps us understand how we can grow our skill. Every game is about learning in that sense. Every game helps us go from a basic skill that we have, build more competence as we learn how to deploy that skill, and grow that skill over time so that we have a better skill. This is competence. This is the competence factor of self-determination theory. The next factor that's really important for us to stay engaged with the game is autonomy. What's autonomy? Autonomy means that, again, it's important to think about the illusory attitude that we're accepting that there are certain rules, but we're not limited by the rules in the game world. So we feel that we have an independence, and as you know, because it is a game world, that independence is usually a little bit of a lie. Any game designer is a very good liar, trying to pretend that you have all the possibilities that you can in the game world, but you might actually not have the option to do everything. It just looks like you can do everything. Grand Theft Auto, yes, I can do everything in that game world. Well, no, you can't. There's still laws of gravity apply. There is certain things that you can and cannot do. When you're on a mission, you cannot do things that are contrary to the mission and so forth. So there are always limitations, but the feeling that the player has is supposed to be of autonomy. I can do whatever I want without limitations. And then relatedness. Again, a very important point for feeling self-motivated is a relatedness that I feel to the other people in the game world. Now, games themselves, back in their history, before they became computer games, are a highly social activity. Think about Go, chess, some of the early games, they only worked with multiple players. So they only really work well when you have an opponent that you can play with. That relatedness has gone a little bit around the 90s and the early 2000s, but it has come back really, really strong with the advent of esports games, team-based games. A lot of the games that you buy on a computer these days are games that foster some sort of social interaction. Why? Because this relatedness aspect, the aspect of having a strong feeling towards the other people in the game, drives us to do a behavior in the game world. Okay. Good, so self-determination theory is at the heart of building intrinsically motivating, gameful experiences. Now, I've used this word gameful experience quite a lot, and you're probably thinking, okay, Sometimes he talks about games and then he talks about play, but he also talks about gameful experience. What does he actually mean with gameful experience? Well, gameful experience is a term that came about as we are trying to define gamification, and it is distinct from a playful experience. A lot of applications, a lot of toys that we have playful experiences. We pick it up, we do something with it, but it's not really limited by a system context. Now, in gameful experiences, and we recently wrote a paper about this, trying again to define it properly, it is always an interactive state. An interactive state where one person is trying to do something. First of all, they perceive non-trivial, achievable goals that are created externally. Okay, so they now know they are in a system where they don't necessarily have created all of the goals, but the goals are achievable. They're non-trivial, but they're achievable, so they pose some sort of challenge to them. They are motivated to pursue them under an arbitrary set of behavioral rules. So again, the game designer puts in some rules saying this is the rules within which you can interact, and this is the behavior that I want you to exhibit. Again, gamification is very much about channeling a certain behavior. I want you to learn, I want you to get more fit, I want you to do something. Okay, good. And then it evaluates that motivation as voluntary. This again relates back to that concept of the illusory attitude. You need to want to do it. If it's not voluntary, it's not a gameful experience. It's a coerced experience. It's some sort of experience, but it's not a gameful experience that we want to have. So, the question then is, there's some magic to these gameful experiences that we can create. But we really have to think about building goals, building rules, and how to engage people in these actions voluntarily. So the question remains is, how do we create these gameful experiences? And it's really about different strategies to make an engaging experience. Different strategies to create these gameful experiences in the applications that we design. So when we talk about gamification languages, we're really talking about different strategies to achieve similar things. I can explain what a certain word means. I can explain that in English. So I say, okay, gamification means the application of game design elements in non-game context. I can then explain that in Spanish. Actually, I can't because I don't know Spanish. But you could also explain that in Spanish, so you would translate it, be the same concept. I could do it in German, and I could say, Gamification ist die Anwendung von Game Design Prinzipien in einem Nichtspiele-Kontext. And you're looking at me and you're like, what did he just say? You did not understand it because I was using a different language, right? So the interesting thing is that when we're looking at this metaphor of languages, it's really like different strategies that can help us achieve similar things. So don't always view them as things that are completely distinct, as design approaches would be. But in languages, there can be an overlap, there can be an understanding, there can even be flavors. If you think about different regions in which you speak different dialects, there's probably a different dialect in Tenerife, the way that Spanish is spoken here, and then in Barcelona. So there, I guess Barcelona has Catalan, so there's definitely a different language there. But so you can look at different dialects for the same language. So gamification languages help you find distinct approaches to game design that can have some form of commonality, that help you understand or decrypt meaning of the interactions that you're doing as a designer. So it helps us understand what's going on around you in gameful design. So these are the 5 gamification languages that I want to present to you today. And again, these are based on a couple of years of research in gamification, where we've looked at, so what are different strategies that we can use to build gameful experiences? And these are the 5 ones that I think are pretty good ways to achieve gamification on their own or together. And this is why I like the metaphor of languages, because each one of these will achieve a somewhat good, successful gamification, and they will achieve a great gamification if they're used together, but they will also achieve good gamifications if they're used in separate, as a separate strategy. Okay, so what do we have? We've got goals and challenges, we have quality of content and context, we have incentives, we have voluntary interaction, and we have game mechanics. And all of these are essentially the 5 gamification languages that I'm presenting today. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with goals and challenges. Now, as I mentioned before, goals and challenges are quite unique to the design of games. When we're building a game, we're essentially saying you need to set a goal and you need to help players affirm that goal. So it's not just setting a goal, but also letting players know, okay, I'm moving towards a goal. That goal is relevant in some way to my own life. That goal helps me understand something that I didn't know about my behavior before. Goals help players pursue different challenges. Again, a goal guides you to a challenge. This is why I put goals and challenges together. Getting to the goal usually poses a challenge. You have to overcome something that's in your way to get to that goal. That is what poses the challenge. And the different challenges can help you accomplish tasks that you would not usually do. And this is interesting, specifically in gamification. We don't just put a random challenge on the board and we say, okay, score a 6 to continue moving in that direction. No, it's something like, okay, so you want to get fit, you want to use our gamified fitness application to get a healthier lifestyle, to get more sport in your life. How are you going to achieve that? And so the gamification designer then sets these goals and sets the challenges that you have to overcome. So every day you have to eat less than this amount of calories. Every day you have to do these amounts of exercises. And so we're putting these challenges in there that then relate to whatever pre-nursery goal, I already have the goal of losing weight, I bring to that context, okay? So goals and challenges as a language in this case means explaining that way of overcoming a challenge that I already have and breaking it down into sub-challenges that help me achieve that overall goal. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm reframing a difficult task, or several difficult tasks, would be eating less, doing more exercise and all of that stuff. I could just give that to a person and say, well, this is what you have to do to lose weight. It's quite simple. These are the steps that you have to take. I'm reframing them as a game now, because I'm saying, well, in this game, first of all, I'm entering this magic circle of the game where I'm saying, now we're in this game world. I can even take the representation away from the person. I say, this is your avatar. A lot of successful fitness applications use animals or little avatars that represent people and say, oh, well, this is the avatar that you now have to train to make that avatar stronger. Okay, good. Now I don't identify with myself, but I identify with the avatar. And these are the steps that I now have to take to get there. So really, if you think about it, it's very much like taking a task list and reframing that task list as missions or quests and help the player achieve each of the missions. Now, as a game designer, you set each quest as a goal. So you're saying, okay, the goal for today is achieving that, the goal for tomorrow is achieving that, and so forth. And it's really about breaking it down and putting it into unique situations for that person that are not necessarily like the normal situation that they're in, but it can be something like fantasy or some other situation that they're in. So instead of saying, do 5 push-ups, it's now you do 5 push-ups for the animal, and then the animal will be happy for that day. Or you do 5 push-ups to build your character, and then your character will have new abilities to do something after that. So instead of looking at myself at that point, I am distracted by this other environment that I'm in that I want to achieve those goals for. So again, the strategy is putting those goals and challenges inside a gamified app to achieve a behavior change. So keep in mind, it's a strategy that you can use just on goals and challenges. If you were to use just that, you probably can get some sort of interesting, successful gamification. I'm not saying it's the golden strategy is the only one, but it's one way to approach it. So keep in mind, it's like a language. And you can have different flavors. Just as I said, you can have different dialects. So again, like I said, it could be something like with an avatar, or it could just be a procedural challenge. So you can only get to challenge number 3 if you've completed challenge number 1 and 2. This is a slightly a reframing of the progress that you're doing, but it is essentially a dialect of goals and challenges at that point. So the next language is quality of content and context. Two big words again, but content and context are really important when you're designing a game world. So the focus is here very much on designing the experience of the players. The experience of the players comes very much from the content that you have inside of the game world and how that content is relevant to you as a person. Are you personalizing that content? Are you mindful of what context you're playing in? Part of why Pokemon Go was so successful, and what was the other game from? Ingress, yeah, exactly. Why Ingress wasn't, is exactly because of the content and the context. If you look at the heart of it, the server structure, the underlying algorithms, and a lot of the stuff actually comes from Ingress, a game developed, I think, basically for Google, and one of the first big successful AR games, if you want, alternate reality games. And the reason why Pokemon was so successful is because all of that infrastructure was there for them to take. But they switched content and context. They said, well, now it's about Pokemon, and now you have to catch the Pokemon. Okay, interesting. So now a new motivation was there to interact with a similar, an older system. So it was very much about how do we guide this experience for the players. Now if we go back to our example of the fitness app, it would be, how do you explain to people how they're doing the exercise? You could do push-ups. I could do them right here. You could say you can only do push-up when the sun is shining. You can only do push-ups at night. You can only do push-ups after you've eaten this amount of food. You can only do push-ups after you've eaten that amount of water, drank that amount of water. So essentially, all of a sudden, you're adding instructions that add context and that add some sort of content what you're doing. So as game designers, this is at the heart of what most of our design is. Our design is usually focusing on context, on participants, and on meaning whenever we're designing something. So context is always the object, the stories, the behaviors that the game exhibits. The participants are the people that are engaging in that. And the meaning is the decisions that you make in how you pursue those actions in content, right? So context very much is about the flavor that you give to the game that you're designing. And when I say it can be used as a separate language, yes, you can try and add this gameful element to your gamification app. It will not be completely gamified. Again, you're not having goals and challenges at that point, but you're adding some quality context. You're reframing, you're adding fantasy to the actions that people are doing in the game world. Again, it's a language that you can speak. I'm not saying any language is correct, but it's one way of approaching that. So, and again, you can have different flavors of that too. The third one, and this was the language that most gamification designers spoke at the start, is the language of incentives. Now, when I talk about incentives, I talk about rewards, badges, and gifts. And those are very common extrinsic motivators for doing an activity. Rewards are meaningful to players. Of course they are. But you can have rewards that don't help people in any way get a better behavior. It's just a meaningless point, it's just a meaningless badge. To make it meaningful, it has to relate to whatever the player wants to achieve in the first place. So whatever overall behavioral goal you have when you're designing a gamified application or a learning application, in learning the goal is clear, you want somebody to learn something that they don't know yet, that needs to be related to the reward. So I can't just get a reward for anything, but I get the reward when I can properly have a conversation in Spanish, if the goal of the app is to learn Spanish. I get the reward if I have done X amount of push-ups that day. Okay, so I get a reward that triggers whenever the behavior is done at that point. The badges that I could get, and these could just be indicators that they don't necessarily need to be rewards, but oftentimes badges are considered rewards too. They're just little plaques that you put on. I should only get them when I measure personal skill progression and learning, and they should always match the player and the environment that I'm in. If I get the healthy body badge after I've eaten 50 calories, but the calories came from a burger, then I might want to rethink if that's the correct context in which I want to deliver that kind of incentive. So it's very important to consider it as a whole. And of course, another factor of giving incentives is the randomness at which they happen. So yes, they need to be related to the activity, but if you don't know when exactly it triggers, it's a much stronger incentive. So if you know at some point, when I feel strong enough, when my avatar is grown strong enough, an incentive or a gift will be triggered, but I don't quite know when that point is, you're working much harder to achieve it, because it's not, okay, after 500 push-ups, you're going to get that, but it's like, okay, when your character has done enough push-ups to feel fit, it will be triggered, and in the end, you put in a range between 300 and 500, at some point in between there, it will trigger, and you're going to be way more motivated to do the action at that point. So, it really depends on the person, but always, when you're building these incentives, always focus on what's the intrinsic goal. Again, in our fitness app, that I used as an example here, the goal was losing weight. So any incentive, any reward that I have should relate back to that original idea that I brought to the application. It shouldn't relate to anything that is monetary, as we sometimes see, okay, you get more money, or that is social, okay, your social status is better. None of that matters. The only thing that matters is my personal progress towards weight loss, if I use that as an app. So any incentive that I have in that system needs to relate back to that personal goal that I bring to that. Okay. And again, you could use just incentives, and a lot of early gamification designers have just used incentives to some more or less success. But now we actually have the research that shows us that really this is only effective so long. Such as some languages are more effective at explaining certain concepts than others. This language might be good at explaining a short-lived concept, but it might not be good to explain something more complicated. So it is a language that you can speak, but it might not be the most effective language to speak. The fourth one is voluntary interaction. And again, voluntary interaction, I think, is a very important language to speak, because that's a mindset that oftentimes designers do not adopt when they build gamification. So first you must decide what you want your player to learn. As I said, games are very much learning opportunities. We had the quote this morning from Ralph Costa that said, fun is basically another word for learning, and that's quite true. Games are very much about reframing learning. So what do you want your player to learn in your game? And then the gameful rules that you put into place must seem reasonable and easy to engage with, which makes that interaction desirable. So if your rules are too complicated, you will not achieve that goal of learning. So accessibility in that case of the learning system that you're in will make your learning more effective, will make your game in that case more effective. And the outcome of the interaction must then be motivating for the person as well. So by giving people an option, and John and I actually talked about this when he talked about his gamified classroom, and I said, what's your secret? How do you make the students learn? Because students know when they come into a classroom, they know at the end they need to get a grade. So if you want to gamify that environment, it's very difficult, because they know at the end I want an A, B, C, D, I want a high mark, a low mark. What's the way to do it? It's giving them an option at the start and saying, well, if you want to take the regular route, you can take the regular route and you'll get your regular grades. But if you want to engage this amazing narrative that I've done for you in the world of Lost and with the Dharma Initiative, you can engage in that, and that can be super exciting. And now you're in that world that you've opted to be in, and we're reframing all of your learning activities in that new world. And then you get the opt-in for people that say, you know what? All of this freedom is something that I want. It's something that will push me forward as a person. So enabling voluntary interaction is already, it's a language that you can speak to make your gameful design more exciting. It is one of the options. It is not the only option. And now we come to a language that's a quite universal language and helps a lot. It's kind of like the Latin of the gamification languages. So a lot of the concepts can be found in other languages, but it's one of the core languages that is good to speak as a game designer. It's the language of game mechanics. If we know how to speak game mechanics, we know how to build the underlying factors and drivers and cogwheels of games. And essentially it's about rules. Rules are limitations of your actions in the game world, as I said before. Rules introduce friction. They let you not achieve something easily, but achieve something in a much more difficult way. So game mechanics are really understanding how do I put something in the way of my player, but they're also thinking about the system. Remember the Pokemon exercise that we did earlier when I showed you how to analyze a system of a game. Game mechanics are all about that. Reframing interactions that you do in the real world, in everything. Everything can be seen as a system. A bottle of water and the water pouring out, physics in the real life, the way my voice transcends around the room, all of this can be seen as a system. It can always be seen as there's an object, the object has a property, there's a relationship, and then there's an environment that this works in. Breaking it down into these 4 parts helps us build good systems, and it helps us build triggers and logic of our game system that we then can frame an interaction in. So really, it helps us scaffold these ideas. And if we relate back to our fitness app exercise, it's the idea of what actions do you want to do every day? What actions, how are you clustering your actions within the level that you're in as a person, the fitness level, the health level? How do you want to build those actions over time? How do you want to reframe the challenges? Maybe today, it's Sunday, I have a different exercise that I need to do than on Monday. So all of a sudden, I'm reframing the interactions that I have to do. But again, game mechanics are all about building that core. So how do I use the gamification languages? Now that I know these 5 different languages that I can speak when I interact with the world of gamification, if you want to call it that. Well, each language is a way of approaching gamification, but it can also have its own dialect. So you can take something like game mechanics, but you can add your own dialect, you can add your own brand. We're only doing reward-based mechanics, or we're only doing random mechanics. Sure, you can do that. This is the dialect that you want to speak as a company. Works perfectly. You can experiment with each language to find the one that works best for your interaction or learning problem. And this is interesting because sometimes your problem demands that you speak a different language, right? Like sometimes you're going somewhere in the world. Let's say you're traveling to France, but you're meeting a Spanish person. So all of a sudden, you can't speak French. You have to speak Spanish at that point because then your interactions will be understood. So similar in the gamification space, you might come across a problem where all of a sudden you have to shift your language to address that problem properly. So ensure that you evaluate your gamification also as a successful gamification. This is the last point that you really have to check, is my gamification successful? And I'll give you some examples of how you could do that in a quick way in a second. But first I want to remind you that these are the 5 gamification languages. Take good note of them. Goals and challenges, quality of content and context, incentives, voluntary interaction, and game mechanics. And again, these are the languages that you take into the world, into the gamification world, that help you understand how the gamification world works. How do I evaluate that it's effective? Well, one of the options that we provide is the Gameful design heuristics. And this could be a talk of its own, but it's not. This is a separate paper that I submitted recently. And Gameful design heuristics are basically checkpoints that we can take into our practice as designers that help us evaluate, okay, the gameful design at this point is effective. If you want to know more about those, there's a link on our website. They again go into these ideas of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, as well as context-dependent heuristics. So they touch upon the languages that I talked about earlier, intrinsic, extrinsic, context-dependent, but they also touch on all of the items that you should have inside of the game world. So I leave you with a reminder that you're embarking in the world of gamification. Wherever your travels take you in that world of gamification, you need to remember that sometimes you will have an easier time if you're in a certain area of gamification if you speak that specific language. But when you travel into a different area of gamification, you need to speak a different language. But sometimes you're in an international, multinational city, and you actually need to speak several languages to succeed. Let's say you travel to Toronto, and you wanted to build something big. You probably have to speak 3 languages to have that impact that you want, because it's a big multinational city. So the same way for gamification, you want to make sure that you're well versed in all of the languages that I've presented. And again, I close with the quote from Coster saying, "Fun is another word for learning, and learning enables gameful experiences." So really, what we want to enable are gameful experiences. The gamification languages help us enable these experiences, and you need to understand the languages in the gamification countries. So that being said, I thank you very much for your attention. I thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you have some questions for me. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Go ahead.
Lennart, I have a question here. It's about this voluntary thing. Now gamification is being used mainly in companies.
Mm-hmm.
Not for clients. For clients it's more or less okay.
Give you a mic.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about this voluntary aspect. Because in many cases when gamification is used for actually improving the processes in a company or for inside, I mean it's not for customer, there's a problem is that of course you need and that all the workers that you have in your company go through that. So it's not a contradiction in terms when you say voluntary, and how do you see that part? Because I mean it's a little bit confusing when you say no, this only works with when it's fully voluntary, but at the end in the real life this is not the context. I mean in 80% of the situation at least.
Well, it's a very good question, because it's the actual problem that we had when we introduced gamification as the solution to a lot of the problems that we have in companies. And it actually is not for some of the learning and some of the mandatory stuff that we have to go through. Gamification is not the solution. And I'm actually of the opinion that in some cases you should not use gamification in these cases, because it will not be effective if everyone has to do it. There might be little mini games or other things that people can play in the company that helps them understand certain aspects, and you can give them 5 or 6 different games to choose from. But if you say this is the one game, everyone goes through it for training, I can say it's definitely not the most effective approach you can do in a company. It might be more effective to go through a traditional standard learning setup at that point.
And this is also opening my second question is, I mean, we have even an experience of bad use of gamification in universities. So people just do a kind of reduction of gamification to budgets, these kind of things. And at the end, they transmit the idea that it's quite easy to do it. So people are doing very badly. And the end is that in many cases it's not effective, and actually it's getting even the opposite effect that they were pretending to. So people go only into the system for gaming the system and trying to get all the budgets and not learning anything. So how can we, avoid that part? I mean, in terms of how can we deal with these situations? What will be your suggestion for avoiding these bad, poor gamification approaches?
Yeah, so first of all, I personally don't provide value judgment when I present the languages. Like I said, in theory, you can speak only one language and it's fine. It might work for your context, but it will not be the most effective. So you could just speak the language of incentives, and that's just the way that you approach gamification that way. It's not going to be most effective, but it's still going to be some sort of gamification that you're doing there. Okay, good. So negative or not, we don't want to say, we just want to give it as tools to designers. But on the other hand, if you want something where everyone has a chance of having the most effective learning experience, then really the question is, do I want people to all engage in the same way? Can I do something that is more personalized? And that is currently our best solution, where instead of having a class of 30 people that are all learning in the same way, it might not work. You might have to do some sort of assessment with people. Okay, that person has a preference for this person has a preference for that. So then you avoid that people are trying to game the system, trying to cheat outside of the system, because really the system that you've put in front of them is not a system that they want to opt in. So this, of course, means more work for the instructional designer at that point, providing different options that a person can engage in, but more personalized options where it's less likely that people can cheat. Now, in the end, I said a game is a magic circle. It's a voluntary system that you opt in. That voluntariness, for games at least, will never go away. You just need to find the different framings of, okay, this works for a different person than this works for another person. It's the same as genres in games. Some people only play first-person shooters, others only play role-playing games, and they will never touch the other one. Now, if you put a first-person shooter in front of everyone and said, everyone has to play Doom now, you will likely not get everyone engaged in that, right? But some people would rather play Minecraft or something else. So it's giving that opportunities that is most likely to yield success in your specific case. But again, there will always be cheaters, so for some people it just doesn't work. You know.